My name is Sam Ewell, and I should probably start by saying I live locally here in Winson Green and Summerfield, and I'm a part of a Christian collective or community called Companions for Hope. And our strapline for Companions for Hope is cultivating abundant community from the ground up. So that's the one thing I want to unpack to talk about. The question, what is your contribution to mission, this kind of thing, frame it very much, and along that strapline is something that we came up with collectively, cultivating abundant community from the ground up. Now, you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I'm a U.S. national. I married a Brazilian, and we lived in Brazil for 7 years, and served as missionaries, raised our children there, and very much felt adopted. That became a second home, and now Brum has become a third home. So I'm an outsider insider, if you could put it that way, here in Birmingham. And in thinking about this cultivating abundant community from the ground up, it's very much a kind of outworking of my PhD thesis. My thesis had 4 chapters, so I very much sense that this is the 5th chapter. It's trying to live that out. And one of the insights that came to me in writing the PhD, I guess you could call it a methodological insight, is that we always begin in the middle. That's a phrase I took from Rowan Williams, that what he means by beginning in the middle is that you're never starting from scratch. There's always a previous story. There's always lived experience that you're bringing. And we do theology well and constructively and creatively and critically when we're aware that we're in the middle of our personal story and the biblical narrative and the middle of the story of the place where we are. So what it meant for me to begin in the middle very much in terms of my doctoral research was being a U.S. national, married to a Brazilian, and living as a missionary in Brazil. Now, part of that journey, here's the moment of full disclosure. I married a Brazilian, and our wedding vows were from Ruth, so your people be my people. So it was a kind of Ruth narrative in reverse when we went. And we went to Brazil. We sensed God's call because we wanted to share life together. We wanted to raise our kids biculturally, bilingually. And yet, once I arrived there, I found myself cast in the role of helper. You're here to help. That was the air I breathed. Not just from American churches, which I think there is a cultural bias towards helping the outsider and the other, but actually from Brazilian churches, they had internalized that. You're an American. We know what you're here to do. You're here to help. So being cast in that role of professional helper was about 3 years in. That was the air I was breathing, and really that was quite disruptive. Trying to figure out what am I here to do if I'm not just here to help, and to serve people with projects and service delivery models. So the full disclosure is that I've come to you as a recovering do-gooder. That's how I would describe myself, recovering do-gooder. I do believe that God calls us to do good in the world and to be aligned with the good intentions that God has in the world. But there's a difference between that and just rocking up with your good intentions and delivering them. So as a recovering do-gooder, that turning point that led to my PhD was actually encountering a thinker and priest named Ivan Illich. Anyone ever heard of Ivan Illich? Mm-hmm. Yes, you have.
Isn't he the man from Uncle?
Yeah, right. So before 2007, I'd never heard of Illich. And a friend introduced me to Illich and kind of heard a bit of my story, was used to having some Americans around, and just a great listener. And he said, I think you should read Illich. He sends me a link to a 1968 talk that Illich gave called To Hell with Good Intentions. Illich delivered that talk in 1968 to gap year North Americans in Cuernavaca, Mexico, who were already there to spend a year. And Illich, to say the least, burst the bubble of good intentions. How many of you would have gone to the south side of Chicago to spend your summer or your year? Why do you think that you can just show up and drop good intentions on people? And he really was, kind of messing with that idea that mission is simply, that good intentions are enough. And he ends the talk with this phrase. He says, come to Mexico, come to learn Spanish, come to pick the flowers, come to walk in our hills, but please do not come to help. That's how it ended. And I remember thinking, either this man is just having a proper rant and just really cranky, or actually he sees something that I'm longing to see, a different kind of presence. So it was that initial encounter, this awareness, encountering Illich, that led me to think about which led me to my research question actually, which was, what does it take for mission to be, how do you distinguish between missionary presence that is missionary without being manipulative? And then pairing back from that, because Illich was a historian and learning more about that history, given the history of colonialism and open veins in Latin America, to use the title of the book, on what basis do we go on being and making disciples, going to others with good news? So those research questions about what does authentic missionary presence look like, that's how I turned to Illich. Now, in the Viva they asked you, what's your original contribution to knowledge? That kind of question, and it was pretty straight ahead. Illich, when he does theology, he talks about the incarnation. That's the center. He talks about the Christian life as the vocation to prolong the incarnation, which doesn't mean that we replace Jesus or that we're Messiahs, but we share in the life of the Son. As the Father sends me, so I send you, from John's sending narrative. So through the Spirit, we're able to be actual members in the body of Christ. So Illich said that's the basis for the incarnation, for mission. But Illich also showed the corruptions of that mission, how it's distorted, how for him the twin dangers, the twin things that distort mission are professionalization on the one hand, that you're there, that all the power is in a role as an expert, and only this person has the power to diagnose and say what's wrong, to say what your needs are. That that's a danger in mission. And tied to professionalization is institutionalization, which Illich would say confuses the process of being a neighbor and loving the other with a product that we receive. So Illich would say, quite simply, hospitals don't care. Only people care. Hospitals might enable people to care, but hospitals don't care for anyone. And he would say the same thing about churches. Churches don't disciple anyone. They might enable people to be and make disciples, but only people. So care, love, are human activities that only people can do. So he was aware of how that incarnational logic could be distorted as well. But he also, the third constructive thing from Illich was that he showed how, what recovery might look like. So he played on this idea of addiction and recovery. And recovery, he called it convivial recovery. So conviviality, this word conviviality, is simply, it means life together. It means life together. Conviviality is what we shared. It's that which happens around the table. When people come together, they share joy. It's a kind of interdependence and sense of belonging through relationships. So Illich said, we need to recover conviviality because we're addicted to professionals and institutions telling us what we need and then promising to deliver what only people can actually do. So conviviality in that sense, in Illich, the shorthand definition, it's just about human interdependence. A more technical definition is it's the recovery of freedom through interdependence, human activity being recovered. So that's what I read about and learned through Illich. But very quickly, the context that I wanted to share with you, where conviviality came to life for me, actually wasn't in the church in the first place. It was in the Samba circle. So if I can ask you to put your pens down for just a second. Sure. Samba circle, I was invited to cross the threshold and become a learner of Samba. And in the Samba circle, my instrument was the agogo. Okay? An agogo is simply a cowbell with two notes. By itself, quite noisy, not very musical. You probably wouldn't want to dance to it at carnival. But when I arrived there, not just because I was a gringo or non-Brazilian, but there were a range of abilities. They said, for the first month, we're not going to touch our instruments. Because you can only play what you hear. And they got us to do exercises like this, okay? So I just want you to step, just do this. We don't even have to stand up, but we're just going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to ask you to clap on 1 and 3, okay? Like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now ask you to clap on 1 and 3 and say 2 and 4. Ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Already Andrew's all out. Okay. This is just. No, but the point is,
This is a working nightmare.
it's just a brief microcosm into my shame and humiliation. The point was, they said, if you can't hear it and internalize it in your body when it's 180 beats per minute with 40 people, you're not going to be able to play it. So they got us to learn to first step and to count, to clap and to do this. And they said, you've got to learn to be, in one sense, independent as a musician. You've got to learn to hear and then play. But they said, in Samba, it's not about playing right or just playing your part. It's about playing together. So then, but first we had to learn to internalize it and to hear it and to bring our instrument. And then we came together. So that phrase, it's not just about playing right, but playing together, that was ringing in my ears. And then when we came around to playing, I realized, actually, when I got home to practice, that's not very interesting by itself. But when I'm in the Samba circle, and there's 40 people, and you've got, Mike playing the bass, and Carmel's playing the snare, and you've got your hebiki, and you've got your tambourine, and you've got the whole car, and I've got my gogo, it's starting to swing, and I'm responding to you, and actually, the agogo-ness of the agogo, if you will, it's more itself. It's not competing with you, but it's more itself. And I realized this is what Illich saw, and he wanted us to see. That conviviality is about, it's neither independence, it's just me over here playing by myself, but it's also not dependence, me falsely thinking I can't show up, and it's about that whole thing. So the Roda, or the Samba circle, became a parable for what the body of Christ is called to be. Everyone has an instrument, everyone has a gift. What does it look like when we come together? And what Illich taught me to see is that whatever we say about ecclesiality, whatever tradition we come from, it can't be less than convivial. We have to find ways to share our gifts and not just play right. I'm over here, yeah, this is my part, but to play together. From that experience and finishing the PhD, I had this idea of conviviality. Could it be that recovering conviviality might be something that's actually the way forward in mission? That was the sort of wager of my research. But then we wanted to live it out. And just quite briefly, Companions for Hope, the community I'm in, we have been trying to cultivate abundant community from the ground up. Really, I would say 18 months in, all we can say is that we've experimented a bit. And 3 insights of what it might be about. Three things that we've sort of taken away that relate to this notion of conviviality. One is observing and interacting. So whereas the do-gooder, the role that I was cast in to be, it's about profiling needs and meeting them. Convivial relationships, it's about observing and interacting. So living where I do now, I still, in the same way in Brazil, I think, okay, I'm on the school gate, I see the same parents every day. How do I get past hello without being creepy? I still want there to be some interaction. I still want to respond to get to know them. What does that look like? One experiment that we had here was to do a bus stop cafe, which literally we just said, okay, we have our coffee in the mornings. What if we had it outside on the street by the bus stop and just serve free tea and coffees? As a way of intentionally observing and interacting and just hearing people's stories, hearing, instead of thinking that we have the treasure in our backpack, we could be treasure hunters and see what comes of that. Now, out of that, we met a few neighbors that said they were interested in gardening. And there was an invitation from the prison to connect with the community. And they asked us, we'd like to do something around that. So we realized, actually, gardening could be another way, another convivial space. And the second principle, if you will, or insight that we observed is what if we reincorporate discarded things as a way of trying to rebuild community? Because in a place like this that's post-industrial, there's a lot of things that are thrown away, and there are a lot of people that are allegedly rubbished. So if the first response, the question was, what are we being invited to do? The second question that we began to internalize is, what's being rubbished or neglected or thrown away, and how can we reincorporate it? And the third thing has to do with the notion of edges. In biological terms, an edge is where two biological systems come together. So imagine a woodland and a pasture. Different species tend to inhabit different edges. And what we began to imagine is, what if, so if in a biological system, at that edge where the forest starts, you actually have more diversity there. That's where the most diversity is. In a biological system, that just happens. What would it look like to mimic that? So conviviality is just a way of tending that edge. What would that look like? And because we're dealing with people and not just biological systems, edges can be harmful or beneficial. They can be places of conflict where we don't know enough about one another to even approach one another. Or they can be places where an American and a Brazilian and a Brit and people from different countries come together and there's a richness. So the third idea that we began to experiment with was cultivating edges. That place where diversity can happen but isn't always positive. That conviviality is simply a way of tending the edge without trying to control it. So those are three things: the observation interaction, reincorporating what's discarded, and cultivating edges. So in conclusion, I've brought another parabolic show and tell object. This is the parable of, I would call this the parable of the compost heap. Mike and I have been talking about the compost heap. But for me, as I've tried to seek conviviality and be present, and cultivate abundant community from the ground up, the place that's most shaped my imagination besides the summer circle has actually been the compost pile. So this is actually, technically it's a wormery, but they're doing that work that happens in a compost pile. So it's a place that I've learned, quite fascinated by it at a number of levels, because even today I can take this, I can put this here, and what's considered rubbish will actually become, this will become life, this will become a site of life. And so taking those things that are thrown away, considered of no value, and seeing where life happens out of them, that's become sort of a principle, if you will, a way of doing it. And so I think that I would just say, the real question going forward is, what is the song that God has given each community or person to sing? As a collective, Companions for Hope, that song is cultivating abundant community from the ground up. For me personally, having reflected about conviviality and what that means, that, let's call it a riff on that song, or variation on that song, is a preferential option for the discarded. This is one way I found to go to the margin without objectifying the margin. One way I found to be present without the hubris of, I'm in control, I have all the gifts. One way to be there and think, I have a role here. I can tend in the same way that I tend the compost pile, but I'm not doing the work. This has given me a way to say, beginning with the discarded, I will try to build community. And the more time I spend around the compost, the more time I think that's how God works. That God doesn't do waste. And that beginning with Jesus, who was, we could say, the king of the discarded. Because Peter tells us he was the one that mortals rejected, but God chose to be the precious stone, the cornerstone, and that we're called to be living stones. So moving forward, that song, what I want to try to sing with others and to hear is that the things that the builders of the world refuse can become living stones. And that moving forward, whatever that means for the church or for theology or for urban life, is that it's probably going to sound foolish to wager on that. And yet, we know from Scripture that God's wisdom is foolishness to the world. And so maybe it's places like this that fools can gather
to share that foolishness.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Yeah.